Patricia Lanning's voice cut through the crisp evening air like the crack of a whip. "This gate is non-compliant. By next month it'll be removed. The board has already approved the demolition." She stood there with her clipboard, chin high, pen tapping the iron bars my father set in place 30 years ago. Neighbors slowed their steps on the sidewalk, pretending not to eavesdrop, but unable to look away. She loved an audience, and she thought tonight would be another one of her victories. I didn't flinch. My hands rested against the cool brick as if I were steadying something fragile, though my voice came out steady, sharp. "Funny thing, Patricia, you're threatening to rip out a structure that still sits on an active city fire marshal permit, the one I helped design when I was a safety inspector." Her pen froze mid-tap, and the silence from the gathering crowd shifted with the weight of those words. Just a tease, but enough to make her falter. If you've ever felt that surge of power when standing up to bullies, hit subscribe now. This showdown is about to become a masterclass in fighting back. I straightened, letting her see the calm she hated most. "Daniel Mercer," I said, my voice carrying just enough for the neighbors to hear. "Retired fire inspector. I've spent my life writing the codes you like to twist into weapons. And this gate? My father laid the brick himself. He's gone now, but every layer he set is still holding this neighborhood together. You think you're just ordering a demolition? What you're really doing is trying to erase a man's legacy." Patricia's jaw tightened, and for the first time in months, she didn't have a smug comeback ready. The truth was, this wasn't about property values or aesthetic compliance. It was about the last physical piece of my father I could touch. I still remembered the summer heat rolling off the pavement as I carried buckets of mortar for him, his steady hands guiding mine as we set the first bricks. He used to say, "Build it so the fire trucks can get through, son. One day, it'll matter." When he died, the gate stood as the marker of his life's work, something solid in a world that had fallen apart too quickly. Watching Patricia circle it with her red pen felt like someone trying to tear down a gravestone. And it wasn't just about my father. Claire, my wife, came home late most nights, exhausted from hearings. Her government vehicle sat parked in our driveway, its decals gleaming under the streetlights. Patricia hated the sight of it. She claimed it lowered the neighborhood's sense of safety. Though everyone knew the truth, Claire's very presence reminded Patricia she couldn't bully every family into submission. That car symbolized authority she couldn't control, and I'd be damned if I let her use HOA bylaws to strip my wife of dignity she earned in every courtroom. "Where are you watching from?" I want to know, because whether you're in a small town cul-de-sac or a city high-rise, you've probably seen people like Patricia, people who mistake power for ownership, who think intimidation equals authority. I kept my voice even as I leaned closer to the gate, brushing my palm along the warm iron. "You've picked the wrong person, Patricia. You may hold a clipboard tonight, but I hold something you'll never get your hands on. Knowledge, legacy, and the law, and I don't lose when those three stand together." My words weren't a threat. They were a promise. She turned on her heel, scribbling something furiously on her notice pad, but her pace gave her away. It wasn't victory in her stride. It was retreat. And as the neighbors exchanged glances, I knew one thing. She'd just started a war she couldn't win. The next morning, I found the violation notice taped to my front door, the paper already curling in the humid lakeside air. Bold red letters screamed, "Final warning," though it was the first time Patricia had ever filed anything formal against us. Claire picked it up, shaking her head as if the weight of the ink were heavier than it should have been. "She's not going to stop," she said quietly, her voice flat in the way only someone used to fighting battles in court could make it. I could see the strain beneath her calm. Last night's confrontation had shaken her more than she admitted. I carried the notice down the walkway, past the trimmed hedges and across the cul-de-sac toward the community center. It was early, but I knew Patricia would already be there, setting up for her so-called compliance review sessions. She loved playing judge and jury with homeowners who just wanted to be left in peace. The center's glass doors reflected the lake behind me as I stepped inside, the smell of lemon cleaner clinging to the air. Patricia's voice carried down the hall before I even saw her. "If we let one family skirt the rules, soon the whole neighborhood collapses." She was talking to two other board members, but her eyes locked on me the second I entered. Her smile was thin, sharp, like the edge of a knife. Mr. Mercer, she said, I trust you've read your notice. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I let the silence stretch, the sound of my shoes on the polished tile louder than any words. Finally, I held the paper up between us. You know as well as I do, this isn't enforceable. That vehicle is government issued. State code trumps HOA bylaws, and you're well aware of it. Her expression didn't crack, but the board members shifted uncomfortably. They weren't used to anyone calling her bluff so directly. Patricia, of course, doubled down. Codes are subject to interpretation, and here, the board decides the interpretation. She said it like scripture, her voice echoing against the empty walls. I walked closer, lowering my voice so only she could hear. You think interpretation gives you power, but interpretation without authority? That's nothing but noise. I've testified before city boards, Patricia. I know where this ends if you keep pushing. Her pen tapped against her clipboard, faster now, a tell she probably didn't realize she had. The board members avoided my eyes, but one of them, Martin Diaz, glanced at me for just a second too long. His gaze flickered with something like doubt, maybe even regret, before he quickly looked away. Patricia gathered her things, dismissing the moment with a tight smile. We'll see, Mr. Mercer. We always do. She brushed past me, the scent of her perfume hanging in the air like a warning. The other members followed, though Martin lingered a heartbeat longer, his mouth opening as if to speak. He shut it again, and I let him go. There was no point forcing a confession from someone still trapped between conscience and fear. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, scattering gold across the water. I stood on the community center steps, violation notice crumpled in my hand, and let the air fill my lungs. Patricia wanted this to be about power plays and paper fines. She didn't realize she was stacking her case against herself, one unlawful move at a time. Claire pulled up in her government sedan, the decals catching the sunlight. She rolled down the window, her eyes finding mine. Another notice? She asked. Another mistake, I said. She sighed, glancing back at the lake as if searching for peace in its stillness. Daniel, I can handle courtroom battles, but this feels personal. It is personal, I told her, slipping into the passenger seat. But not just for us. She's doing this to everyone. We're just the first to push back. As we drove past rows of manicured lawns and identical mailboxes, I spotted more neighbors watching us than usual. Curtains twitched, conversations paused. Patricia thought she could isolate us, turn the community against us with her notices and threats. What she didn't realize was that every escalation made the cracks in her authority a little clearer. And I was going to make sure those cracks widened until the whole facade came down. By late afternoon, I found myself standing in the small neighborhood park that overlooked the lake, the one place that hadn't yet been touched by Patricia's endless lists of improvements. The benches were worn, the swings squeaked with every gust of wind, and the old oak tree in the center still bore initials carved decades ago. It was a place that carried memory, not polish, and maybe that was why I liked it. It reminded me of what a community was supposed to feel like, lived in, not staged. I wasn't the only one who sought quiet there. Martin Diaz sat at one of the picnic tables, papers spread out in front of him, though he wasn't reading them, his elbows pressed hard into the wood, hands covering his face as though holding it together required real effort. When he finally lowered his hands, I caught the flicker of his expression, torn, uneasy, the kind of look you see on someone who knows they're complicit but not yet ready to say it out loud. He noticed me a second later, stiffening in his seat. Daniel, he said, his voice low, cautious. Didn't expect to see you here. He tried for casual, but his eyes betrayed him. They darted to the papers, then back to me, then away again, like a man trying to guard too many doors at once. I sat down across from him, letting the weight of silence do what words couldn't. He fidgeted, tapping his pen against the edge of the table, the rhythm uneven. His shoulders hunched as if bracing for an argument, but I didn't give him one. Instead, I just studied him, and it was clear he knew I'd already seen too much. You're not here to enjoy the park, I said finally. You're hiding. He gave a small, sharp laugh, the kind that wasn't joy but defense. From what? Patricia? She doesn't scare me. But his foot tapped under the table, quick, restless, and his eyes wouldn't stay still. Every part of his body screamed the opposite. I leaned forward slightly, lowering my voice. I watched you today in the community center. You wanted to say something, but you didn't. The pen slipped from his fingers, rolling across the table. He grabbed for it too quickly, knocking his papers askew, and for an instant, I caught the header at the top of the page. Board authorization request. He snatched it back, pressing the sheets flat, his jaw tight. I can't. It's not that simple, he muttered, his hands clenched until his knuckles went white, then opened again, restless, like he didn't know what to do with them. The weight of his conflict wasn't in his words. It was in the way his body betrayed him at every turn. I didn't push, not yet. Instead, I let him sit in that space, his struggle spilling out through every nervous tick. He wasn't Patricia, not by a long shot. He wasn't built for confrontation, but he'd chosen to sit on her board, to back her decisions. And that choice was eating him alive. The wind carried the sound of children laughing from the swing set, their voices sharp and innocent. Martin's eyes followed them, his expression softening for the briefest moment before hardening again, like someone reminding himself not to care too much. His shoulders rose, then sagged, a man carrying a burden no one could see but him. Finally he stood, gathering his papers with too much force, the corners crumpling in his grip. I have to go, he said quickly, almost rehearsed. Lots to prepare for. But as he turned, his steps faltered. His posture was rigid, but his pace slow, the kind of walk you use when your mind is somewhere else entirely. I watched him leave the park, his back straight but his hands gripping the papers like lifelines. I didn't need him to speak. His body had already told me everything. He was caught between loyalty to Patricia and the knowledge that what she was doing wasn't just unfair, it was dangerous. And sooner or later, that conflict would break him open. The next HOA meeting took place inside the Lakeside Clubhouse, a glass-walled building that smelled faintly of chlorine from the indoor pool. Residents filtered in, some out of obligation, others out of fear. I sat near the back, watching as Patricia positioned herself at the head of the long oak table, her clipboard like a weapon, her smile sharper than usual. She thrived in this space. It wasn't about governance, it was theater, and tonight she wanted a spectacle. Claire sat beside me, posture straight, her government ID badge clipped to her jacket. She didn't speak, but her presence was enough to draw eyes. Patricia noticed too, and the glint in her expression told me she meant to use that against us. The meeting began with the usual monotony. Landscaping updates, pool maintenance, reminders about trash collection. Then Patricia cleared her throat and shifted the papers in front of her. Our next agenda item, she announced, voice carrying through the hall, concerns continued noncompliance by the Mercer household. Specifically, the persistent parking of a marked government vehicle in clear violation of community standards. Whispers rippled through the room. A few neighbors looked uncomfortable. Others glanced toward us with barely concealed curiosity. I let the silence settle before speaking. You know, state law supersedes HOA policy on this, Patricia. That vehicle is protected. Her smile didn't falter. Laws are open to interpretation, she countered smoothly. And interpretation falls to this board. The Mercer vehicle is disruptive to the neighborhood's aesthetic integrity and creates unnecessary concern for safety. Therefore, fines will be levied, $200 a week until compliance is achieved. The room stirred louder now, the sum of voices like an undercurrent of unease. Claire shifted, her eyes fixed on Patricia, but she didn't speak. She didn't have to. Everyone in the room knew exactly who she was, and Patricia knew it too. That was what made her smirk so chilling. She wasn't intimidated. She wanted the confrontation. I leaned forward, my voice steady. You're pushing too far. You know this is illegal. Patricia tapped her pen against the clipboard, each click deliberate. Mr. Mercer, rules exist to protect the community. If you believe otherwise, you're welcome to take it up with the courts. She paused, letting the weight of her words hang in the air before adding. Of course, litigation could cost the association thousands, and if we lose, assessments will rise. Your neighbors won't thank you for that. It wasn't just an attack, it was a strategy. She wanted to pit the community against us, to make us the villains for defending our rights. Around the room, I saw the unease deepening. Some avoided my eyes altogether, unwilling to be caught on either side. But then my gaze landed on Martin Diaz, sitting 2 chairs from Patricia, his hands clasped tightly together on the table, knuckles white, shoulders rigid. He didn't speak, but the tremor in his jaw gave him away. He knew this was wrong. Patricia pressed on, her voice louder now, performative. This is about order. If we allow one family to ignore the rules, what message does that send? That chaos is acceptable? That our community is no longer secure? A woman from the 3rd row raised her hand nervously. But it's a government car. Isn't that different? Patricia's eyes snapped to her, cold and sharp. The rules do not change depending on the vehicle. Consistency is the foundation of fairness. The woman lowered her hand quickly, shrinking under the weight of Patricia's glare. I clenched my jaw, every instinct telling me to fight back harder, but I forced myself to wait. Patricia was building her own case against herself, and the cracks were already showing. When the vote was called, Patricia's allies raised their hands without hesitation. Martin hesitated, his fingers twitching on the tabletop. His eyes flicked toward me, just for a heartbeat, before his hand rose slowly. His body betrayed him again, every muscle tight with discomfort. He had chosen loyalty over conscience, at least for now. The motion passed. The fines were official. Claire's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away from Patricia, not once. As the meeting adjourned, neighbors scattered quickly, whispers trailing in their wake. Patricia strutted from the table like a queen leaving her court, basking in her small victory. But victories like hers were fragile. They weren't built on law or truth. They were built on fear, and fear only held power until someone called its bluff. 2 days after the meeting, I walked the perimeter of Lakeside Reserve with a clipboard of my own, not to hand out violations, but to study. The late afternoon sun poured across the sidewalks, lighting up cracks in the pavement and the angles of fire hydrants tucked near the curbs. Years of habit came back to me, the rhythm of observation, the silent cataloging of risks and compliance. I wasn't looking for trouble. I was looking for the detail Patricia had missed, the kind of oversight only a trained inspector would notice. Halfway down Oak Shore Drive, I found it. The side access lane, built decades ago for fire truck entry, had been narrowed by a row of hedges Patricia's board had ordered planted last spring. The landscaping was neat, beautiful even, but it reduced the clearance by almost 2 feet. I measured it twice, pen scratching the numbers onto my pad. City Fire Code required 16 feet of unobstructed clearance for emergency vehicles. The lane now barely measured 14. Patricia's so-called aesthetic improvements had just created a violation more serious than any parked car ever could. I crouched low, running my hand along the hedge's edge where the soil had been freshly turned. Sprinkler lines ran under the brush, still damp from morning watering. They'd invested good money into this project, convinced it would impress buyers and boost property values. But in reality, they'd just jeopardized access for the very trucks that gate was designed to allow through. The irony wasn't lost on me. Patricia had spent weeks trying to paint Claire's government vehicle as a danger to the neighborhood, yet she had overseen a modification that violated fire code outright. My pulse steadied as the pieces aligned. This wasn't just hypocrisy. It was leverage, and leverage was what I needed. Later that evening, I sat with Claire on our back porch overlooking the water. The cicadas buzzed, a constant low hum as the sun bled orange across the lake. I showed her the measurements, the code references, the sketches I'd made. She leaned back, exhaling slowly. "She won't back down just because you've caught her breaking a rule," Claire said. "If anything, she'll fight harder to bury it." "She can try," I answered, "but the difference is, my evidence doesn't just sit on an HOA bylaw page. It sits in city code. That means outside jurisdiction. That means Patricia's little empire isn't the final word anymore." Claire studied me for a moment, her eyes sharp but tired. "You're sure you want to take this step?" I nodded. I didn't spend a career testifying to protect public safety just to watch someone like her undo everything my father built. This isn't only about us. It's about every family here who can't fight back. The night air grew heavier, pressing down as if it carried the weight of choice. I could almost feel my father's voice, steady and certain, reminding me that fire lanes weren't just lines on pavement. They were lifelines. And Patricia had put those lifelines at risk for the sake of landscaping symmetry. The next morning, I drove to the city safety office, the old brick building where I'd once clocked in before dawn for inspections. The lobby hadn't changed. The smell of coffee, the echo of boots across tile, the corkboard pinned with inspection schedules. I signed my name on the visitor log, the pen dragging slightly as if the paper resisted the weight of what I was doing. Inside, I spoke with a deputy fire marshal I knew from years back. He listened as I laid out the measurements, the code requirements, the photos I'd snapped with precise angles. His brow furrowed deeper with each page. "You're telling me this was approved by the HOA?" he asked. "Approved, funded, and planted under Patricia Lanning's direct oversight," I replied. He tapped the papers against the desk, thoughtful. "That's a violation, and not a small one." I left the office with the certainty that my first real strike had landed. It wasn't loud, not yet, but it was enough to shift the ground beneath. Patricia's feet. She thought she could weaponize bylaws. I had just armed myself with something heavier. City code, enforced by people she couldn't intimidate. As I pulled back into Lakeside Reserve, I drove past the narrowed lane again. This time, I didn't just see hedges. I saw the beginning of her undoing. The morning after my visit to the fire marshal's office, I headed to the neighborhood pool area. It was early, the air still damp with dew, the smell of chlorine sharp in the air. Families usually gathered here on weekends, but today the place was quiet except for the hum of the pool pumps and the distant chatter of landscapers. Patricia had scheduled a compliance check at the pool, her latest attempt at turning community spaces into stages for her authority. I took a seat at one of the wrought iron tables near the water, clipboard resting in front of me. From here, I had a clear view of the new fencing and landscaping she'd ordered installed just last month. At first glance, it looked pristine, a white picket fence with fresh mulch and ornamental bushes. But I wasn't here to admire appearances. I was here to measure, document, and confirm what I already suspected. The fence line cut too close to the emergency exit gate leading from the pool deck to the fire access lane. I walked over, tape measure in hand, ignoring the stares from two residents who had come for morning laps. I pulled the line across the narrow clearance, barely 36 inches of space. Code required at least 48 inches of unobstructed egress for evacuation routes. Patricia's improvements had created another hazard. My chest tightened, not from nerves but from certainty. This was no longer about a single fire lane or hedge line. This was a pattern. Patricia was altering structures without permits, violating city codes, and putting residents at risk, all while pretending to be the guardian of aesthetics. As I noted the measurements, the clubhouse doors opened. Patricia entered with her ever-present clipboard, heels clicking across the pavement. Behind her trailed Martin Diaz and two other board members. Martin's gaze caught mine briefly, then dropped, his hands folded tightly behind his back. His posture was stiff, his jaw set, but his eyes betrayed the same unease I'd seen at the park. Patricia scanned the pool area like a general surveying her troops. "Mr. Mercer," she said sharply, "you are not authorized to conduct inspections here. This is private property." I turned, holding up the tape measure. "This is a community facility, and I live here. And what I'm measuring isn't a preference issue, it's a safety violation. You've narrowed an emergency exit below code. If this pool ever needed to be evacuated quickly, someone could die because of your fence." A murmur rose from the few residents present. Patricia's smile tightened, though she didn't let it falter. "You're fear-mongering," she snapped. "Our improvements are for the benefit of the community. No one has raised any concerns except you." I took a slow step closer, lowering my voice so it carried only to her and the board. "That's where you're wrong. The fire marshal already has these measurements. They're reviewing every modification you've overseen this year, and they won't need my interpretation. They'll cite you directly." For the first time, Patricia's pen stopped mid-tap. The color drained slightly from her face, though she quickly masked it with another forced smile. "If that's the case, we'll handle it in due process," she said smoothly. But her eyes flicked to Martin, searching for support. He didn't meet her gaze. His hands trembled faintly at his sides, his shoulders drawn so tight it looked painful. I tucked the tape measure back into my pocket. "Due process is exactly what you've ignored, Patricia. But I won't. This isn't over." The tension thickened in the air as she turned sharply, signaling the board members to follow her. Martin hesitated, lingering behind a step too long before finally walking after her, his shoulders hunched. His body language told me more than any words could. He was cracking under the weight of her orders, torn between loyalty and the growing awareness that she was dragging the entire board into liability. I stayed by the pool a while longer, listening to the sound of the pumps gurgling water through the system. The place felt different now, less like a gathering spot and more like evidence. Every misplaced fence, every hedge too close to an access lane, they weren't just inconveniences. They were hazards, and I had the proof to show it. That night, Claire and I sat at the kitchen table with my notes spread out between us. She traced her finger along the lines of my sketches, eyes sharp. "You're building a case," she said quietly. I nodded. "Not just for us, for everyone here?" For the first time since this began, I felt the balance shift. Patricia thought she was tightening her grip. What she didn't see was that every move she made left another crack in her armor, and I was ready to drive the wedge deeper. The rain came down in sheets that evening, hammering against the roof of the small lakeside cafe at the edge of town. The place was quiet, dimly lit, the kind of spot where people met when they didn't want to be seen. I sat at a corner table nursing a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, waiting. Martin had called me earlier, his voice low, shaky, asking if we could talk away from the neighborhood. He hadn't said much more, but I didn't need details. I already knew what was eating at him. The bell above the door jingled softly, and Martin stepped inside, his jacket soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead. He scanned the room, spotted me, then crossed the floor quickly like he didn't want to give himself time to reconsider. He slid into the seat across from me, his hands still trembling as he tried to wipe the rain from his glasses. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The storm filled the silence, wind rattling the windows, thunder rolling over the lake. Finally, Martin exhaled hard, his shoulders collapsing, as if he'd been holding his breath for weeks. "I can't do this anymore," he muttered. His voice was barely audible over the rain. "I can't keep covering for her." I leaned back, letting him take his time. His fingers twisted around the coffee cup the waitress had just set down, knuckles pale against the porcelain. He looked smaller than usual, as if the burden had been pressing him down inch by inch. "She's been bypassing votes," he said, his eyes fixed on the tabletop. "Every major decision, the hedges, the fences, even the new security system, none of it went through proper approval. She drafts the minutes afterward, makes it look unanimous. Half the time, the board never even sees the proposals until after the money's already spent." The words came faster now, tumbling out like water breaking through a dam. He rubbed his temple, grimacing. "And the funds. She's been moving them. Maintenance budgets shifted to cover landscaping projects, reserve funds drained for cosmetic upgrades. I tried to raise concerns quietly, but she shut me down every time, said questioning her in front of the others would make me look weak." I studied him, the guilt etched in every line of his face. He wasn't just confessing, he was unraveling. His foot tapped rapidly under the table, his body betraying the turmoil of someone who had stayed silent too long. "Why now?" I asked, keeping my tone calm. He swallowed hard, eyes flicking to mine for the first time. "Because what you found with the fire lanes, that's not just another bylaw argument. That's liability. If there's ever an emergency, if someone gets hurt, the board is responsible. And I'm on that board. My name's on every document she signs. I can't afford to let her drag me down with her." He pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and slid it across the table. His hand shook so violently it almost slipped from his grip. I opened it carefully, recognizing the format instantly. Official meeting minutes. Except these weren't the sanitized copies Patricia handed out. These were drafts, unedited, raw, notes scribbled in margins, missing signatures, lines crossed out. And at the bottom, a line written in Martin's careful hand, "Approval deferred, no vote conducted." "She filed this one as approved," Martin said, his voice tight. "But it never happened. That fence at the pool, she pushed it through without so much as a discussion. I've got more like that. Dozens." The storm outside cracked with lightning, illuminating the strain on his face. He looked like a man standing on a cliff, terrified of falling, but more terrified of what would happen if he stayed put. "I need you to understand something," he said quietly, almost pleading. "I'm not your enemy. I went along because I thought it was easier, but easier has turned into dangerous. And now I need out. I folded the paper and slid it back toward him. You hold on to these, I told him. They're your shield. When this breaks open, and it will, you'll need to show you tried to resist. Martin's eyes glistened, and he nodded slowly, relief and fear warring in his expression. For the first time, his body eased, shoulders lowering as if handing me the truth had lightened the load. As we left the cafe, the storm began to ease, the rain softening into a steady drizzle. Martin walked beside me, quieter now, but not as hunched. He'd given me the missing piece, the proof that Patricia wasn't just overreaching, she was falsifying authority. And with that, the path to her downfall was no longer just possible. It was inevitable. The next Saturday, I drove into the city and parked in front of the fire marshal's office, a squat stone building I'd walked into countless times during my career. The air smelled of rain on asphalt, still heavy from the storm that had passed the night before. I carried with me a slim binder filled with measurements, photographs, and sketches. But what I really carried was Martin's confession, burned into memory if not on paper. Patricia wasn't just careless, she was reckless, and now I had enough to prove it. Inside, the lobby buzzed with the quiet efficiency I remembered well. Inspectors in uniform shirts moved in and out with clipboards and radios, their boots echoing across the tile. I signed in, my hand steady this time, then sat across from the deputy fire marshal I'd spoken to earlier in the week. His nameplate read, M. Howard, a man I knew from my years on the job, and though he hadn't aged much, the lines around his eyes told me he'd seen more disasters than he cared to admit. I laid the binder on his desk and flipped it open. Here's everything I've measured so far. 2 separate egress routes narrowed below code, landscaping reducing clearance at the fire lane. And here, I tapped a photograph. This exit gate from the pool deck measures 36 inches. State requires 48. Howard studied the photos, his jaw tightening as he turned the pages. You're right, he said finally. This isn't just cosmetic. If a fire breaks out, emergency response could be compromised. Liability's not just on the HOA. It falls on every board member who signed off. I leaned back, letting that sink in. That's the problem. They didn't sign off. Patricia bypassed the board. She altered the minutes afterward to make it look like a vote took place. One of her board members admitted as much. Howard's eyes flicked up to mine, sharper now. You can prove that? Not on paper yet, I admitted. But he's cracking. He's seen what she's doing and knows. He'll be dragged down with her. When this comes out, he'll talk. Howard closed the binder, fingers drumming lightly against the cover. All right, he said. Here's what we'll do. I'll schedule a site inspection. We'll walk the property, document everything ourselves, and if it checks out the way your notes say, Patricia will get a citation she can't talk her way out of. Relief washed through me, but it wasn't victory yet. Patricia would fight, deny, twist facts until they bent her way. But now I had something she couldn't manipulate, an outside authority, bound by law, whose word carried more weight than any HOA bylaw. When I stepped back into the daylight, the city street bustled with weekend traffic. I paused, letting the sound of horns and crosswalk signals anchor me. For the first time since this began, I felt the tide shifting. I wasn't just defending myself anymore, I was building a case strong enough to pull her down completely. That evening, Claire and I sat together in the living room, the binder resting on the coffee table between us. The lamplight caught the edges of the photos, stark reminders of how far Patricia had already gone. Claire's expression was calm, but her eyes carried a weight I knew well, the look of someone balancing fury with control. You've done your part, she said. Now it's about letting the system catch up to her. But Daniel, you know she's not going to go quietly. If she sees this slipping out of her control, she'll lash out harder. I nodded, running a hand over the binder's cover. Then let her. Every move she makes digs her hole deeper. I just need to be ready when it happens. Through the window, the lake reflected the fading light, ripples breaking across its surface in the evening breeze. I thought of my father then, of his hand steady on the bricks of the gate, his voice telling me to build something strong enough to last. Patricia had spent months trying to tear that strength down, but she hadn't realized yet. She wasn't just fighting me. She was fighting the law itself, and the law had a longer reach than she could imagine. By the time I turned out the lights that night, the path ahead was clear. The inspection would come, the citations would follow, and when they did, Patricia's empire of intimidation would start to crumble. All I had to do was hold steady and let the truth do its work. The morning of the inspection, I stood at the neighborhood's front gate, the one my father had built stone by stone, the one Patricia had threatened to demolish. The sky was overcast, the kind of heavy gray that made everything feel on edge. A city truck pulled up, orange lights flashing, and 2 inspectors climbed out, clipboards in hand. Behind them was Howard, the deputy fire marshal, his presence a quiet assurance that this wasn't just a courtesy visit. This was official. Patricia was already there, of course, flanked by 2 board members. She wore her confidence like armor, lips pursed, pen tapping against her clipboard as if sheer rhythm could make her untouchable. Neighbors gathered in small clusters along the sidewalks, whispering, phones in hand. They knew something was coming. They just didn't know which way it would fall. I greeted the inspectors calmly, giving them space to begin. They walked the lane first, measuring tape stretched across the narrowed entrance where the hedges had been planted. One shook his head, scribbling notes. Patricia's smile tightened, but she said nothing. We moved toward the pool, and I let them lead the way, my footsteps steady, resisting the urge to savor every crack forming in her facade. At the pool deck, the inspectors measured the exit gate, 36 inches. One of them muttered under his breath, his pencil pressing harder against the paper. Howard didn't say much, just observed with the quiet authority of a man who'd seen enough violations in his career to know exactly how this would end. Patricia finally spoke, her voice sharp but controlled. These modifications were made in good faith, with the best interests of the community in mind. Aesthetic improvement increases property values. That's a documented fact. Howard turned, his voice even but firm. Aesthetic improvements don't outweigh safety compliance. If someone needs to evacuate through here and can't, property value won't matter. The murmurs among the residents grew louder. Patricia's pen froze mid-tap, but she forced another smile, directing it toward the crowd rather than the inspectors. We'll address any minor adjustments as necessary. Minor adjustments. That was her attempt to spin it. But I saw the inspectors' expressions. This wasn't minor, and the neighbors saw it too. As the team continued, I hung back, watching Martin. He stood slightly apart from Patricia and the others, arms crossed, posture stiff. His eyes followed every measurement, every note, his jaw tight. When Howard called for a short break, Martin stepped closer to me, his voice low. "She's going to try to bury this," he said. "Even with citations, she'll spin it, blame the contractors, claim ignorance. She won't stop unless the board turns on her." I met his gaze. "Then you and the others need to decide how long you want to sink with her. You've seen the evidence. You know what's coming." He shifted on his feet, looking toward Patricia, then back at me. His hesitation was still there, but it was thinner now, worn down by the weight of what he'd seen with his own eyes. His body gave him away, hands tightening into fists, shoulders rigid. He was preparing himself for a choice. The inspectors finished their notes, conferring quietly with Howard. Finally, Howard addressed Patricia directly. "You'll receive a formal citation within the week. You'll be required to bring all access lanes and egress points into compliance immediately. Failure to comply could result in fines and further legal action." The color drained from Patricia's face, though she forced a polite nod. "We'll, of course, cooperate with the city." Her tone was honeyed, but the tremor in her hand betrayed her. The crowd began to disperse, neighbors whispering, some glancing my way with cautious approval. For months they'd watched Patricia rule unchecked. Now, for the first time, they saw cracks in her armor, saw that she wasn't invincible. That evening, back at our house, I spread my notes and the inspector's preliminary findings across the dining table. Claire read them carefully, her eyes narrowing at every detail. "This isn't just about a citation," she said. "It's about trust. Once the community knows she's been risking their safety, she won't have the power to scare them anymore." I leaned against the chair, the weight of the day settling in. "Exactly. She's always thrived on intimidation. But intimidation crumbles when people realize the law isn't on her side." The lake shimmered outside our window. the last light of day fading across its surface. The gate stood at the entrance, silent but unyielding, a reminder of the legacy she'd tried to erase. Tonight, it felt stronger than ever. The strategy was no longer just in motion. It was working. Patricia's empire had been built on fear, but fear was fragile, and I was about to break it wide open. The library meeting room was packed, every chair taken, and neighbors lining the back wall. The HOA had chosen the space for its monthly session, thinking the neutral ground would silence tensions. Instead, it only magnified them. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the air carried the thick edge of anticipation. People weren't here for pool updates or landscaping reports. They were here to see if Patricia could explain why city inspectors had walked through the neighborhood and left her visibly rattled. I sat near the middle, Claire beside me, her presence calm but unyielding. She had a file folder balanced on her lap, though she hadn't opened it. Her silence was enough to command respect. Patricia took her seat at the head of the long table, flanked by two loyalists, though even their expressions looked strained. She adjusted her blazer, lifted her clipboard, and tried to summon the same smug smile she always wore. But it faltered at the edges. "We'll begin tonight," Patricia announced, "with a discussion of recent city inspections. I want to assure everyone the HOA is in full compliance and any adjustments will be minor." Her voice carried confidence, but her eyes betrayed the nerves behind it. A low murmur rolled across the room. People weren't convinced. They'd seen the inspectors, heard the tape measures snapping open, watched the notes being written. Patricia was spinning, and the neighbors knew it. I stood slowly, holding a slim folder of my own. "Minor?" I asked, my voice steady. "Is that how—" "You're choosing to describe narrowing fire lanes and blocking evacuation routes." The silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Heads turned, eyes locking on Patricia. Her pen froze against her paper, tapping halted. "Mr. Mercer," she said coolly, "this is not the place for dramatics." "No," I said, "this is exactly the place. Because what you call dramatics, the city calls violations. And those violations aren't theoretical. They put every family here at risk." Whispers swelled again. Patricia straightened, her smile hardening into something brittle. "The board approved those projects," she countered. That was when Martin shifted in his chair, his face pale but determined. He leaned forward, speaking loudly enough for everyone to hear. "No, we didn't." The room went still, all eyes turned toward him. His hands trembled slightly as he placed a stack of draft minutes onto the table. These decisions were made without votes. Patricia filed them as approved, but they never were. I've seen it. I've been part of it. His voice cracked, but he didn't stop. And I can't stay silent anymore. The silence fractured into gasps, then scattered voices. Patricia's face drained of color. "Martin," she snapped, "you're mistaken. Those were administrative adjustments." He cut her off, his voice stronger now. "No, Patricia. They were falsified records." His eyes met mine across the table, and I gave a small nod. The weight he carried was finally out in the open. Howard, the deputy fire marshal, wasn't present tonight, but I didn't need him here. The neighbors had heard enough. The evidence was no longer just in my notes or the inspector's files. It was in Martin's confession, spoken aloud before everyone. Patricia tried one last time, rising to her feet, her voice pitched higher. "This is an ambush. Daniel Mercer is manipulating this board, stirring fear, trying to undermine stability." "Stability doesn't come from lies," Claire said suddenly, her voice even, but cutting. She didn't raise it, didn't need to. The authority she carried in every courtroom followed her here, and it silenced the room instantly. "It comes from law, and the law is not on your side." Patricia's mouth opened, but no words followed. Her pen slipped from her hand, clattering against the table. The sound echoed, final in its simplicity. The meeting ended in chaos, neighbors demanding answers, board members whispering urgently. Martin slumped in his chair, as though every ounce of tension had finally drained from him. Claire and I walked out together, the cool night air washing over us as voices still rose behind us. Patricia had built her power on fear and secrecy. Tonight, those foundations cracked. The truth had been spoken aloud, and once that happens, there's no turning back. The town hall auditorium was filled beyond capacity, every seat taken and neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder along the walls. The city council had scheduled the special hearing after the fire marshal's office confirmed multiple violations within Lakeside Reserve. Tonight wasn't an HOA meeting controlled by Patricia's gavel. This was public, official, and on record. The weight of that difference hung in the air, thick enough to feel. Claire and I sat together near the front, our presence drawing curious glances. She wore the same quiet authority she carried in the court, while I carried my binder of photographs and measurements, evidence neatly compiled and ready. Around us, the crowd buzzed, some angry, some anxious, all hungry for answers. They weren't just here for rules and fines, they were here for the truth. When the council chair called the session to order, Patricia rose from her seat with a practiced smile. She approached the microphone at the front of the chamber, her heels clicking sharply against the wood floor. "Good evening," she began, her voice calm and honeyed. "I want to clarify some unfortunate misunderstandings. Recent inspections have raised concerns, but I assure you all adjustments were cosmetic, not structural. Our community is thriving, and I stand by the improvements we've made." Boos rippled through the back rows. A few residents shouted over her, demanding explanations about safety. Patricia pressed her lips together and held her smile, waiting for silence before continuing. "Any violations identified are minor and will be addressed swiftly. The integrity of Lakeside Reserve remains strong." I stood then, binder in hand. The council chair motioned me forward, and I walked to the microphone, meeting Patricia's stare as I passed. Her smile faltered. "My name is Daniel Mercer," I began, my voice steady. "I'm a retired fire department safety inspector. For decades, I enforced the very codes we're discussing tonight. And what's happening in Lakeside Reserve is not cosmetic. It's dangerous." I opened the binder, holding up photographs for the council and the crowd to see. "This is the fire access lane narrowed by hedges Patricia ordered planted. 16 feet of required clearance reduced to 14. Here's the pool exit gate, 36 inches wide, when state law requires 48. These aren't minor oversights. They're violations that could cost lives." The crowd erupted, gasps, angry voices, neighbors pointing toward Patricia. She sat stiffly, her pen motionless in her hand. I continued, raising my voice to carry over the noise. "And it's not just safety violations. These projects were pushed through without proper board votes. Meeting minutes were falsified to look unanimous. I know this because one board member finally had the courage to tell the truth." At that cue, Martin rose from his seat at the side of the room. His hands shook as he held a folder of draft minutes, but his voice carried strong. "I'm Martin Diaz, HOA treasurer. I confirm what Mr. Mercer said. Patricia bypassed votes, altered records, and misused association funds. I went along with it too long, but I won't anymore." The auditorium exploded. Some neighbors cheered, others shouted in outrage. The council chair banged the gavel, calling for order, but the damage was already done. Patricia tried to stand, her face pale, her voice raised over the chaos. "These are lies, coordinated attacks meant to discredit me." A man from the back shouted, "My kids swim in that pool, Patricia. You put them at risk." Another voice cut in, "We trusted you with our money." The council chair motioned for silence again, his expression grave. "The fire marshal's office has verified the code violations. The evidence of falsified records will be reviewed, but what's been presented here tonight is serious. The city will issue fines and require immediate corrective action. Furthermore, the board must call an election to determine new leadership." Cheers erupted this time, louder and longer, drowning out Patricia's protests. She stood frozen at the microphone, her carefully built authority dissolving under the weight of public outrage. Claire leaned closer to me, her voice low but certain. "She's finished." I didn't answer right away. I just looked around at the faces in the crowd, neighbors who had lived in fear of fines and threats for months, now standing together, unified. Patricia had ruled through intimidation. Tonight, that power crumbled under the simple force of truth spoken in public. When the gavel struck again, closing the session, the auditorium filled with applause. Not for me, not even for Martin, for the fact that fear had been broken, and the community finally saw that they weren't powerless. The days after the town hall felt different in Lakeside Reserve. For the first time in months, neighbors walked the streets without glancing over their shoulders, without lowering their voices in fear of what Patricia might overhear. The weight that had hung over the community, the fines, the threats, the endless notices, was gone, replaced with a cautious but growing sense of freedom. I stood at the front gate one evening, running my hand over the cool brick my father had laid decades ago. The sun dipped low across the lake, its light catching the iron bars and casting long shadows on the pavement. For weeks, Patricia had threatened to tear it down, calling it outdated, non-compliant, a stain on her vision of uniformity. But now, after the council's ruling, the gate was protected by city record as a fire access structure. She couldn't touch it. My father's work would stand not as decoration, but as a safeguard for generations. Claire joined me, her steps quiet on the gravel. She leaned against the post, her expression softer than it had been in months. "It feels strange, doesn't it? To finally breathe again." I nodded. Strange, but right. This neighborhood forgot what it was like to feel safe from its own leadership. Patricia built her power on fear. Once fear was gone, there was nothing left to hold it up. We walked the path together, past homes that had once been targets. Families waved from porches, their faces brighter, lighter. Martin stepped out from his house, lifting a hand in greeting. He looked tired, but freer, the lines of guilt replaced with a quiet resolve. He'd risked everything by speaking out, and though it had nearly broken him, he was stronger for it. "City's still reviewing the financials," he said as we stopped at his gate. "They'll probably order restitution, maybe even press charges. But Patricia's not coming back. The board's calling for elections next month." "Good," I told him. "It's time for the community to choose leaders who care more about people than shrubs and paint colors." He managed a small smile. "I should have done something sooner." "You did something when it mattered," I said firmly. "That's what counts." As we walked on, I thought about the long path it had taken to get here. Patricia had thrown every tactic at us. Threats, fines, public shaming, even assault when she'd pepper-sprayed Claire. Each escalation had been designed to break us, to isolate us. But the truth was, every one of her moves had only exposed her deeper. Every hedge she planted, every record she falsified, every lie she told, it had all built the case against her. I hadn't won by shouting louder or intimidating her back. I'd won by using what I knew, by leaning on the codes I'd spent my career enforcing, and by trusting that the law would outlast her fear tactics. It wasn't a quick fight. It wasn't easy. But it was just. That night, neighbors gathered at the lakeside park. It wasn't a meeting. No clipboards, no agendas, no roll calls. Just families sharing food, kids running in the grass, the sound of laughter echoing against the water. Claire sat with a small group of women, their conversation light, their shoulders finally relaxed. I stayed by the old oak tree, watching the community rebuild itself in the simplest way, by being together. One of the newer residents came up to me, a man I barely knew, his voice hesitant. "You gave us back our neighborhood," he said quietly. I shook my head. "Number." "We all did. I just reminded everyone that we had more power than we thought." As the evening stretched on, I found myself back at the gate once more, the last light of day fading into night. The iron stood solid, the brick unbroken, a symbol not just of my father's hands, but of resistance itself. Patricia had tried to erase it. Instead, it had become the marker of her downfall. I placed my hand against the cool stone and breathed in the stillness of victory. For the first time in months, the silence wasn't tense. It was peace. If you want more stories of homeowners standing up to HOA tyranny, hit subscribe right now. Share your story in the comments, and let me know where you're watching from.